After another year of fighting, is peace on the horizon for Sudan in 2026? Khartoum has come up with a plan to end the conflict, but the UN warns violence is worsening. Where does this leave the country's future and the millions affected by the fighting? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Sami Zeidan. As 2025 comes to an end, there's still no sign of peace in Sudan. The conflict began more than 2.5 years ago. A dispute over how and when to integrate the paramilitary rapid support forces into the army. Well, this week, the Prime Minister presented a peace plan to the United Nations Security Council. It would see the RSF give up weapons and the territory it controls. But the paramilitary group has already formed a parallel government. And on the ground, humanitarian and security conditions, they're worsening. Millions of Sudanese are caught up in the fighting. Tens of thousands have been killed and millions displaced. We'll ask our guests what 2026 could bring for Sudan in a moment. But first, this report from Michael Apple.
It's a scramble for food and water in this displacement camp in Tawila in Sudan's North Darfur region. But above all else, people here are desperate for peace and safety after more than 2.5 years of conflict between the army and paramilitary rapid support forces. Prime Minister Kamil Idris presented a peace plan to the UN Security Council this week. It proposes that the RSF gives up territory seized and its fighters be disarmed and placed in camps.
It is not about winning a war. It is about ending a cycle of violence that has failed Sudan for decades.
The paramilitary group has rejected the proposal, calling it closer to fantasy than to politics. Although the army pushed the RSF out of Khartoum earlier this year, the fighters have advanced in the south and west in recent months. In late October, they seized Al-Fasher, the army's last stronghold in Darfur, and earlier this month took control of the strategic Hajlij oil field in South Kordofan. International aid pledges have dried up, and the UN says a little more than a quarter of humanitarian funding requirements for the year have been secured. For civilians caught in the crossfire, peace can't come soon enough.
We wish the war would stop. I have lost my mother and 3 brothers. I don't know where they are at all. I haven't been able to find out which way they fled.
The conflict has caused the world's worst humanitarian and displacement crises, with civilians fleeing across the border into all 7 of Sudan's neighbors. The UN says 4.3 million people have sought refuge in countries such as Egypt, Chad, and Ethiopia, while another 7.3 million have been forced from their homes and are living in temporary shelters and camps. Both sides have been accused of committing war crimes and crimes against humanity, and UN experts warn that without significant international pressure, coupled with internal political will, the pre-conflict composition of Sudan may be lost forever. Michael Apple, Al Jazeera, for Inside Story.
Well, let's bring our guests into the show. We have joining us from Port Sudan, Ahmad Ibrahim, an independent Sudan analyst. In Miami, Florida, Cameron Hudson, a former director of African Affairs at the US National Security Council. And in Cairo, Egypt, Khalid Medani, chairperson of the Africa Studies program at Canada's McGill University. Welcome to the show. If I could start with Ahmad in Port Sudan. So, is peace in Sudan any more likely in 2026, do you think, Ahmad?
Thank you for having me, Sami. And unfortunately, my answer is not likely, not because the polarization that is a reality now, whether inside Sudan or in the region around Sudan, is between those who want to end the war or those who want to continue the war. unfortunately, the polarization has become about the day after. Who's going to be still standing the day after the war ends? Which format that the war will end with? There is, as you said in the report, the recent roadmap that was announced by the Prime Minister Kamil Idris in the Security Council 2 days ago, which is founding pillar, is that the day after the war ends, there will no longer be any institutional existence for the genocidal RSF terrorist militias, as the government calls it, but it will be disintegrated, and all the remaining fighters will be somewhat integrated into the national army. On the other hand, the plan presented on the table, the other plan is the Quad plan announced in September 12th of this year. And the government's position is that it will not engage with the Quad plan. So the bottom line is what we're seeing from the initiatives that we have now. It's not very promising, unfortunately, 2026.
Let me bring Cameron in and ask this question then. As Ahmad was pointing out there, the disagreement is on the day after. Is that something that outside countries can help with, particularly those countries which are already involved or invested in Sudan?
Well, certainly it's something that they can help with, and they should be helping with. But I don't believe that most outside powers are giving a lot of thought or attention to the day after. We actually heard from Secretary of State Marco Rubio last week that 99% of U.S. efforts are going towards a ceasefire and humanitarian access, which means there isn't much left to think about what a transition might look like or how we would, navigate the very difficult tasks.
Why is that, Cameron?
Ahead in terms of removing the RSF and demobilizing them and establishing civilian governance. So,
Cameron, I was asking you, why is the outside world not looking into the day after, in your understanding?
Well, I think that the day after is a very complicated question in a country like Sudan. There are multiple levels of conflict that are happening inside the country right now. There are local level conflicts that have been unleashed as a result of this national level conflict as well, right? And those are increasingly ethnic in nature. They are, based on long-standing disputes. And those are going to have to be resolved in the long term if we hope to have peace in the country. That takes a level of understanding of the political context in Sudan that I think that most countries don't have. Let's remember that most countries don't have an embassy in Sudan. If they do, there's only a handful that have actual diplomatic representation in Port Sudan right now, very far from where the violence is occurring and where the worst kind of social division is happening. And so I think we've lost a lot of our understanding of the country and how we might go about piecing it back together. It's going to take the Sudanese doing that themselves. I think that the role of the international community, therefore, is to create the space and to provide the opportunity for civilians to organize, for political platforms to form, for the dialogue, the Sudanese dialogue to happen. That's one of the things that the Prime Minister was talking about. He didn't play into an international role, but I think the international role is creating the opportunity for those conversations to happen. That requires a ceasefire first and foremost, and that's why you're seeing the international focus there.
Let me bring Khalid in. Cameron mentioned there perhaps a key term, losing an understanding for what's happening in Sudan. Maybe we should take a step backwards as well as a step forwards and ask, what have been the main drivers fueling and pushing this conflict throughout 2025 to keep it burning and continuing? And how do you see that in 2026? Any reason to think that those factors might die down?
Well, I think the war began. There's been a competition, obviously, political competition between the two military institutions, the Sudan Armed Forces and the Rapid Support Forces. But it's very important to really highlight that the dynamics of the war have changed over time. Now it's essentially a competition over legitimacy and power, and more specifically, building these nascent states. I don't mean that both, institutions or factions, warring factions, are going to successfully build de facto states, but certainly that is what they're struggling to do. Whether it is the Sudan Armed Forces that has established new currencies and tries to demarcate its border, whether it's the Rapid Support Forces that is doing the same thing in Darfur and Kordofan, trying not only to amass a territory through military means, but also to amass as much legitimacy as possible. One of the reasons for that, of course, is to continue to sustain their political power and finances, but also, I would argue, to also prepare themselves for potential negotiations. And that is something we've seen across the board, these wars, which I think it's important to emphasize. And another thing to emphasize is really wars end in the African context, not to really kind of talk about all of the conflicts in Africa, but I think that we really need to understand that wars do end with respect to African civil wars, when there are changes militarily, the balance of power on the ground has shifted essentially. And that is something to keep in mind. Why is that important? That's important because I think I'm also very not so much negative with respect to the war ending soon, but I think it's very important to understand that the Quad statement, the most important aspect of the Quad statement really is this notion that there's no military solution to the conflict. Why is that correct? And the reason it's correct is that most wars or most warring factions, including in the Sudan case historically, have really come together when there's a mutually hurting stalemate militarily. As one Sudanese activist put it really well, there's now a race on the ground militarily.
Do you see that stalemate developing, Khalid? Is that what you're saying? Are you more optimistic that we're going to get to this stalemate in 2026 and the parties come to some kind of end?
I think the stalemate's already with us. I think that we've seen the expansion not only. And I think that, what we see recently, it's very important. Why is that important in terms of the potential for negotiations? What we see in this.
If you give me a second, because I could see Cameron was shaking his head, I think, in disagreement. So I might try and see if we've got some alternative opinion here, Cameron. Just briefly, do you see that stalemate, that we're still far away from it? Am I reading your head shaking signal correctly?
No, I think that the stalemate, this is a very dynamic conflict, right? The conflict has been moving from Darfur into the Kordofans. It's now spreading across the Kordofans. And so from the outside, it looks like a very dynamic conflict with battle lines constantly shifting. So it doesn't look like a stalemate. But I think the professor is right that it is stalemated in the sense that they are trading back and forth between, 10 and 20% of the territory. They go from 40% of the territory to 60% back to 40%. So neither side is able to kind of tip the balance, in their favor definitively in a way that would end the war or compel the other side into a ceasefire. And so we have a stalemate with the illusion of dynamism. And I think that is the problem, is both sides continue to think that they can win the war when in fact it is stalemated and they don't recognize that.
Okay, if we are in some kind of... Go ahead then. I'll let you have a very brief comeback on that, Khalid, before we go to Ahmed.
Yeah, I think Cameron is absolutely right. It is, in fact, a stalemate. That's what I was trying to emphasize. And very quickly, the negotiation, the tripartite agreement in Higleg in Western Kordofan was not something that people could have easily predicted. What we saw is negotiation between South Sudan and the both warring factions to neutralize and disarm the area. I know it's a glimmer of hope. Very few would have predicted there would be a tripartite agreement, including Burhan and Hemeti, with respect to Higleg, which is a very important oil-rich region.
Okay, a glimmer of hope. Where does this glimmer of hope take us, Ahmed? Has the fall of al-Fashir meant that actually the partition of Sudan is more likely than Sudan ever going back to what it was, the sort of unified country it was?
I don't think that the regional bets are on partitioning Sudan. There may be a direction to keep Darfur as a pocket of effectiveness for the RSF to build its military or to rebuild its military potential, and then make a comeback towards the capital and the east. The end game is here. There is the Red Sea and the Nile basin. and the arable land and the large coastline of the Red Sea that Sudan has that overlooks Saudi Arabia. And this is, to put it in a nutshell, this is a geopolitical context. Sudan is just a flashpoint. But I just want to go back to what Professor Khalid has said about the glimmer of hope in the trilateral agreement, this presumed trilateral agreement. I don't believe that there has been a trilateral agreement of any sort. What I hear and what I've read all over is that President Salva Kiir has asked the head of the Sudanese Transitional Sovereign Council so that they can come in and protect the oil refinery that South Sudan depends on. The economical gain from this oil refinery is more strategic to South Sudan more than to Sudan. But and going back to something else that the professor said, it's about the definition of what's going on. If we can't see what's going on in Sudan right now as a geopolitical war, that is one step. Sudan is part of it. It's going to escalate now, escalating in Yemen as well, and it's escalating in the Sahel and in the Horn. It's a whole theater that different actors are trying to influence and to control. And Sudan is trying now, as it is visible from the different trips that that Burhan is making, is to create or to help create this kind of a geopolitical alliance of sorts that will help Sudan in breaking this stalemate. We need to remember that back in May of this year, the army, the balance of power was tipping to the RSF side. The army managed through different processes to expel the RSF from the center of Sudan towards Kordofan. So what's happening now, the RSF is a tool, it's a proxy. There is a difference between ending the war as a security and a military operation. And there is the building of a transition, a civilian-led transition, a political governance structure, the post-war. But
okay, well, we'll talk about that point maybe in a minute. But since we kind of touched upon geopolitics and some of the resources at play, Cameron, let me ask you, what are the geopolitical calculations? What are the geopolitical interests at play here that are driving the sort of the involvement of external powers in this? We've heard a lot about gold. We heard a little bit a moment ago, I think Ahmed touched upon oil and so on, right?
Yes, well, I think there's a host of reasons that regional powers are interested in Sudan. I think we can't ignore the fact that both Egypt and Saudi Arabia, two of the largest powers, share a border with Sudan. The Saudis view the Red Sea as their natural border with Sudan, and it's been a traditional crossroads and cross current for people, for potential smuggling, potential instability coming across the Red Sea. So the Saudis have always been interested in a stable Red Sea coastline, especially now that their own internal development, is leaning very heavily on developing their coastline on the Red Sea for tourism and business development. Similarly, the Egyptians are hosting a huge burden of over 1 million Sudanese refugees at a time when their economy cannot sustain that that endeavor. So you have two big countries, very interested in internal stability in Sudan. I think farther afield, you have other countries that see the business opportunities, whether it's in gold or in agriculture or in port operations. But the Red Sea has become, I think, the biggest, flashpoint in geopolitics in recent years, with the instability in the Middle East, in Yemen. You've seen the United States and European powers really staking a claim to trying to establish greater Red Sea stability. And so countries like Turkey and the United Arab Emirates see an opportunity and an opening for themselves to become more than just regional powers. They can become global powers if they establish a presence for themselves on the Red Sea and if they have influence over Red Sea states. And so you are seeing, I think, there a lot of effort by other countries trying to establish influence over Sudan now that Sudan is in this period of contestation.
All right, and we're getting towards the end of the show, so I want to raise the issue, of course, of the humanitarian suffering. We can't forget about that one. Khalid, in Cairo, we have seen UN agencies warn about famine increasing. We've seen terrible scenes of brutality, of images that appear to show mass executions of people. What will 2026 look like? Is there any reason to hope that some of the suffering for the civilian population will ease?
Well, frankly, it's very difficult to detail the human rights violations, the displacement, the use of sexual violence and famine and starvation as a weapon of war. I think it's documented by a slew of human rights organizations, and you're right to conclude with that. I think that is essential. What does that mean? When you look at it, we did this initially in your show, you had this displaced Sudanese woman from Darfur, and the first thing she said is that she wants the war to end. And that is an analysis that cannot be overestimated and underestimated, so to speak. What I mean by that is that ultimately it is the ceasefire. It is, in my view, a political solution that's important. It's extremely important for us to understand how wars do end, and they do in a combination of factors. One of them is the military kind of changes on the ground, the will of the domestic actors, and absolutely the international community and external actors. And what that means is that coordination with respect to the Quad is the first step. I know many people disagree with it. I find that one of the problems of it is it does not include civil society actors, which are so central to peace, monitoring the ceasefires and implementing peace and transitioning. But it's extremely important to understand what Cameron and Mr. Ahmad have said, and that is external actors and third-party mediators play a crucial role. There is a glimmer of hope here again because, frankly, of the expansion of the war and the threat along the Red Sea, 450 miles with respect to Sudan. So that kind of security interest on the part of international actors has brought, for the first time, really, those actors that have the vested interest, economic and strategic, in Sudan together. How that is going to materialize depends, of course, on the will of the warring factions. But I do want to return to the fact that the only and most sustainable way to end this huge humanitarian crisis is a ceasefire, a sustainable peace, and a transition to a civilian government, which is what the majority of Sudanese people have long wanted, and what is, at least on paper, written in the document of the Quad. And so,
how about, Khalid? How about accountability? Let me take that question to Ahmad in Port Sudan. The ICC it's had an investigation going on into war crimes for a while now. Why is it taking so long? And will there be accountability for some of the allegations and dreadful scenes which many of us have seen?
Well, there is different mechanisms for accountability. There is national mechanisms and there is international mechanisms. For instance, the ICC is embroiled in its own issues right now, and the tension with the United States and Israel and the whole scene around that set of issues. So I think that's really hampering their pursuit for issuing arrest warrants for perpetrators for atrocities and genocide in Darfur. But
so basically, Ahmed, you're saying that politics is interfering with the process of justice here?
Politics is in the center of justice. Justice has been politicized heavily when it comes to Sudan. Otherwise, we would have seen more proactive action from the world. We would have seen the RSF actually not being given the chance to be impugned from any kind of accountability. We would have seen the RSF, it has fulfilled all the check boxes to be designated as a terrorist organization by the UN, by the United States, by the European Union, by all legitimate or sane-minded organizations.
Yeah, I'll let you finish the thought, but we've just got a couple of minutes left.
Yes.
Right,
my final point is this. What's going on right now in Sudan it's not going to stop in Sudan, unfortunately. And we are seeing what's happening in Yemen, and it has to be looked at in the same context.
All right, we've just got a couple of minutes left, so I want to put this question to Cameron. Is this an issue that is going to ultimately be resolved by by outside powers? Or will the Sudanese civil society play a role in deciding what happens in the day after? We should remember a few years ago, the Sudanese civil society was playing kind of a major role in the country, in shaping the country's transition, right? What's happened to that civil society? What's happened to the professional groups, the youth, and so on?
Well, let's remember that at the revolution, it was the civil society that was in the streets and that sparked the revolution and the political crisis at the time in 2019. And so they were able to, I think, have some influence over the shape of the transition. But civil society has been moved to the outer edges of influence in the country right now. And it is the two belligerents fighting this war that I think are defining and setting the political tone in the country, and will have a much larger degree of control over the day after, because they will, any ceasefire negotiation will necessarily flow into a political settlement and a transition. I think the problem, as has been said already, is that the Quad has not engaged in the slightest with civil society groups. They have, intimated in their statement that they would like to see civilian governance take over, but you don't create civilian governance out of nothing. You have to engage it, you have to support it, you have to nurture it over time. And the Quad and the countries that make it up, in addition to the European Union and other kind of Western donors, have done virtually nothing. Right. There are some talks now about trying to bring civilian coalitions together, but that's in a very, very early stage. So I think that the belligerents are going to continue to drive the political conversation
and
going
what happens
forward
in the country. All right, let's leave it there. We'll thank our guests, Ahmad Ibrahim, Cameron Hudson, and Khalid Medani. And thank you for watching. You can see the show again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, head over to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Sami Zeidan, and the whole team here, for now, it's goodbye.